So we start over here usually, guys. You kind of want to make a little...
Everybody over there, please. Over there.
Right.
Enzo. Over there. Go.
Let the kids sneak in front, maybe down here. The little ones come on.
Enzo. There. Batatinha. Come over here. Andy, go there.
So
Go in front. You guys, little kids go in front.
this is the family tree here, you guys. So just to put it in perspective, this is me right here in the bottom corner. My name is Rener. My brothers and I are down here in this chunk. Our father is Orion, who is the oldest son of the 9 children of Grandmaster Elio here. And Grandmaster Elio, as some of you may know, of course my other uncles, Helson, Hickson, Holker, Hoyler, Hoyce, Hobbing, are here. And they're all the children of Grandmaster Elio, who is the younger brother of George, Gaston, Oswald, and Carlos. So he was the smallest of the brothers, Carlos being the oldest one. My grandfather had 9 children, Carlos had 21 children. Yeah, and between the two of them, they had 105 grandchildren, which is my generation, which is this row here. So it's kind of crazy.
But your parents didn't have TVs at home or something?
Yeah,
Amazing, man.
it's crazy.
What jobs did they have?
Have babies and have jiu-jitsu. That's pretty much what they specialize in. But this is it, my friends. This is it. So to kind of put it into perspective, some of you, I'm sure, know the story, but Carlos learned jiu-jitsu from a Japanese man way back in the early 1900s. Carlos became very effective enough to open a little academy in Brazil, and where him and his brothers practiced. All of them, except for Elio, were allowed to practice jiu-jitsu. Elio was diagnosed with some form of illness as a young boy, which restricted him from doing any kind of physical activity, anything. He would run up a flight of stairs and would pass out from exhaustion at the top. So the doctors restricted him from doing anything, including jiu-jitsu. So while his brothers really absorbed the jiu-jitsu and practiced regularly and started teaching classes, my grandfather was like 13 years old, would sit on the side of the mat and would just watch them, only watching. For about 3 years went by. One day, a student showed up for a private class with Carlos in jiu-jitsu, and Carlos was absent. My grandfather was there to spectate during this class, and offered, because Carlos wasn't there, he offered to cover the class. So now he's about 16 years old. He tells the student, if you don't mind, I'll go through the techniques with you until Carlos shows up. The student accepted the offer, and my grandfather, that was the first time he had practiced, went through the motions based purely on the visual absorption that he had gained for over the last 2 or 3 years. He did all the techniques just fine, kind of through rehearsal. Finally, Carlos showed up very apologetic at the end of class, and Carlos and the student said, no problem, you know, it's okay. I had a class with your brother Elio, and if you don't mind, Carlos, I would like to keep training with Elio from now on. So the student promoted my grandfather to a teacher from nothing. And of course, Carlos didn't care. He said, great, go kid, do your thing, and they began practicing that way. And then what my grandfather realized that during this next phase, as he had slowly started gaining more and more students, was that the techniques that he had watched from his brothers practicing didn't work as easily for him. And that was when the breakthrough began, when he realized, man, the moves are working good for them, but for me it's just too much strength. So my grandfather began modifying techniques, and where they would rely on strength, speed, or power, he would substitute, you know, timing, efficiency, leverage, and patience. Really, a lot of patience, a lot of just defending until the opportunity arose for attack. And he started modifying the art to what we now know, you know, as Brazilian or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. It's really not so much of a new technique as much as a new mindset, which is one more of let the guy burn his energy and take advantage of the opening when he creates it, versus go in there and impose your will like a hot knife through butter, which only works if you're fighting someone your size or smaller. So it really became a little man's art in my grandfather's hands, and that was obviously proven in all the fights over the next 30 years in Brazil, 1920, 1930s to about 1950s he was fighting. And he challenged everyone. And that's kind of what you see the whole thing here, is eager to test the effectiveness of his modified jiu-jitsu against other people and to prove that it works. My grandfather would challenge everyone he could find in Brazil. It didn't matter what discipline, what size. There was no MMA, there was no UFC. So this is literally, let's just fight in an arena just for the sake of fighting to see what works. And my grandfather would fight these giants and would defeat them. And people who watched this would become very fascinated by how the little guy could win, and they became eager to learn, and that was really why he did it, right? He fought so he could prove that what he was doing was effective. So here, it says in the headlines in Portuguese, who's going to win? Fred Ebert, the giant wrestler, or Rener Gracie, the jiu-jitsu kid? And this is him at 18, 19 years old, one of his first professional fights, and the museum documents several of those over the years. My grandfather got so good and so famous in Brazil that he really didn't have fights a lot of the time. So to find new challenges, he would put newspaper articles out and newspaper announcements with things like this. And it's in Portuguese here, but it says, with both hands tied, Rener Gracie will fight anyone and will offer 10,000 cruzeiros to whoever beats him. So he'll lock down both hands in the belt like this, and then they would fight. And if you make him say uncle, you get 10,000 cruzeiros. And then the other paper says here, no one showed up to fight Rener Gracie with both hands tied. You know, so like it's really, that was his pursuit of kind of personal evaluation of the art. So he was just always looking for challenges, you know. This was very interesting. A man, Manuel Rufino dos Santos, in Brazil, a former wrestler, published an article after the Gracies were becoming very famous, saying that this was a rigged situation, that it was like fake fights, that these weren't real fights that the Gracies were winning. It was a rigged outcome, which of course was the highest level of offense you could say for the family when they're actually fighting, trying to prove that this stuff actually works. So when my uncle, my great uncle Carlos and Elio, my grandfather, found the article that this guy published, they pursued him, they found him, and while the four brothers held the crowd back, my grandfather took the article, asked him if he wrote the article. He said yes, and then he said, "I'm here to show you how fake our fights really are." And he went on to beat the guy up pretty badly. And this is him here. This is how they did in Brazil back in the day, right? So this is the before and after here. This is him all prettied up. This is him all beat up, broken face, broken shoulder, broken elbow, slammed him on the ground. And my grandfather in this fight really went for it. You know, he wasn't trying to just win. He was trying to punish the guy for saying this, to quote unquote send a message in this regard. And you can imagine this was such an important thing for them because they're trying to create such an understanding that it's possible for little people to win, not for bullying's sake, but to say, hey, if you're going to learn something, learn this. So for someone to say that this is fake, it robs people of the chance to go learn this, and that was the big concern. So when this happened, the guy was so badly beaten, he went to court, lied, and said that all five brothers jumped him simultaneously. That's how badly he was beaten that he thought he could get away with that. And he did. The judge believed him, the jury condemned all five brothers to 2.5 years in prison for jumping the guy when they didn't even do it.
Is that them up there?
That's them out there, yes, exactly. And this is them right here at the sentencing where it says, Gracie brothers condemned to 2.5 years in prison. It was a huge deal when this happened in Brazilian history. Now remember, this is all happening before Pelé was even born, in terms of the soccer player and soccer being big in Brazil. So it was a pre-soccer era where there really wasn't much sportive activity at all. So for these brothers to be fighting and fighting giants, it was a huge spectacle back then. In fact, there was a time in the Brazilian Gracie Academy history where they had a full-time newspaper reporter in the academy that would just send reports daily on what was happening, who was training, and who was fighting, and that's how popular jiu-jitsu was back then. Anyway, so they went to jail, and of course it was a huge uproar from the people, and the president found out the Gracie brothers were in jail and conducted a secondary investigation and concluded that it was a lie, that the brothers were defending the family honor, and that it was Elio by himself, and that it was, you know, all a hoax here. So he gave him a presidential pardon after 2 weeks in jail. This is the public celebrating the release of the Gracie brother in front of the Casa de Detenção, the jailhouse in Rio, and they got released, big celebration, whole thing. So that was kind of a cool thing there. This was interesting. There was my grandfather and Carlos. And just to be clear, Carlos was about 12 or 13 years older than my grandfather, and he became the father figure. They didn't have, their dad was stepped out of the picture early, so Carlos was really the mentor, kind of older brother figure in the relationship. And so they were on a ship from the north of Brazil down to Rio, very high seas, very choppy, and a passenger falls in the water and is unconscious in the water, and huge waves, very windy, and they're watching this. So they send the sailors to go pursue the guy and try to save his life. The problem was the waves were so crashing that the sailors would try to grab the unconscious man, and every time they pulled, the wave separation would cause the grip break, and they could not get him in the water no matter what, and back into the small boat that they were trying to save him with. So my grandfather and Carlos on the boat were watching this, and my grandfather says, Carlos, you know, like, one guy should jump from inside the little boat into the water to grab the guy and then push him to the other guys and feed him in. A sailor behind the guys, a sailor on the boat, said the reason they don't jump in, who overheard the conversation, the reason they don't jump in is because this is Abrolhos. They named the location. What he didn't tell my grandfather and Carlos was that Abrolhos was the largest concentration of sharks in the Atlantic Ocean. This one little spot they were passing through, and that's why they weren't jumping in. Carlos didn't know that. The sailor assumed they knew it, and the conversation ended. Finally, they saw that they were going to leave the guy to die. They turned around, they were coming back, and the man was going to be left while the boat took off. So Elio said, Carlos, how would you like to go save the guy's life? He's going to die. Carlos said, I'd like to, but I don't think I can make the swim, because it was kind of far already and the waves were so crazy. Edu said, I think I can. So he strips down to his underwear and his socks, and without permission from anybody, he dives off the deck of the ship. This is while the other boat's already coming back. So he dives in, and until his last days, when he told the story, I remember him saying that while he was airborne, the thought of sharks crossed his mind. But it was too late, you know, so he had to commit. So when he committed, he just kind of landed shallow instead of going too deep, and he stayed on the surface and swam out, signaled to these guys to come back, and then got a hold of the guy and pushed him in and saved the guy's life. He actually resuscitated the guy later. The guy came back, no problem, and then he got all these medals and recognition from the company of operating the ship. So it was kind of a huge deal, but you know, just another day in the life of Rener Gracie, I guess. Obviously no sharks, he made it out just fine, and it was all good. But that was that. Joe Louis, the boxing champion, the Brown Bomber, the U.S. boxing champ, American boxing champ, went to Brazil on tour, and he said that he published in the newspaper saying, I feel I'm in top shape. When my grandfather saw this article and found out who Joe Louis was, who he didn't know at first, he thought, we can't miss this opportunity. He may be gone quickly, so let's make a challenge. And this is Joe Louis in his prime, by the way, and my grandfather at 140 pounds, soaking wet, saying, I'll give $16,000 for Joe Louis to fight with me this year. So Joe Louis obviously heard the message, and this is the actual handwritten letter from Joe Louis's manager, Marshall Miles, declining the fight with the Grandmaster at the time, saying that he respects all sportsmen of their own field, but doesn't want to fight no rules, like a MMA, like just no rules fight till the end, which was wise. But another example of the pursuit of the challenge, just to see if what he was doing was the right thing, you know. Kimura, all you guys know who that is. The Japanese champion went to Brazil on tour. Kimura and Kato, his second in command. And Kimura was the best Japanese fighter of all time, best Japanese jiu-jitsu fighter of all time. Went to Brazil, and my grandfather found out he was there. He challenged he challenged Kimura. Kimura said, I won't fight you. He said, you're not ranked in the Japanese jiu-jitsu ranking system, and you know, it doesn't do anything for me. He said, and Kimura was much heavier than my grandfather. He said, but Edu, you can fight Kato, the number 2 guy, and he'll beat you just as easily as I would. So, you know, get out of my hair kind of thing. So my grandfather was set to fight Kato, so they set it up, and this is Kato after my grandfather choked him with the cross choke in 6 minutes. Kato passes out, and Kimura, who was there to spectate that match, stepped into the ring and accepted the challenge on the spot, of course, because the number 2 had lost. So the fight was set up for a later date at Maracanã Stadium in Rio, and at the time it was the largest soccer stadium in the world. It's been, you know, the record has been broken since in another location somewhere else. But Maracanã, I think, holds 180,000 people. They took out one of the soccer goalposts, and they wrapped it with about 80, 90,000 people in one side of the arena. The president showed up. It was a huge deal. The fight was set for 2 10-minute rounds, 20 minutes total. Kimura was so confident of victory, fast victory, that he declared that if my grandfather could survive and defend and just not get submitted for 3 minutes, that should declare him the winner. The fight went on. They got him. He grabbed my grandfather and threw him around like a rag doll in a blender in every possible way, and but couldn't close the deal. He would catch him, he would slip out. And that was the Grandmaster's specialty, right, was the defense. So he was surviving the giant, just defending, until finally 3 minutes into the second round, so 13 minutes into the match, finally got caught in the shoulder lock, the Kimura shoulder lock, and he twisted it very badly. My grandfather wouldn't tap, so Carlos threw in the towel, forfeiting the match, and so the Grandmaster lost the fight, and that was the end of that. But it was interesting, you know, kind of what happened after that fight. After the fight, Kimura approached my grandfather days after and invited him to go to Brazil. He was very congratulatory of the performance, and he acknowledged that the techniques my grandfather had displayed, he didn't know they existed outside of Japan. So it was a lot of progress that happened on foreign soil there. So that was a great honor. He didn't go, obviously, and you know, my grandfather thought that it was a good experience because the guy was so much bigger that was just too much to overcome. But the fact that he could survive and defend the way he did, he was confident that if they were in the same weight class or physical capabilities, that his technique was superior. It's just there was such a differential there that it wasn't possible. And that's the actual gi my grandfather used when he fought Kimura back in the day. It's cool bronze statue of the old man there. 1940s and 50s. They did that. And then this is an epic battle as well. Probably the second most famous fight of Edu's career was this fight against Valdemar Santana. 3 hours and 40 minutes without any interruption. It was 1 round, non-stop. It was the longest uninterrupted, no-holds-barred fight ever documented. Nearly 4 hours without a break. And it was crazy. And not to mention that the opponent was 20 years younger than him. He was 42 when he did this fight. The guy was 20 years younger and about 40 pounds heavier than my grandfather. So crazy fight. The record still hasn't been beat, and my father submitted the record to Guinness Book of World Records, you know, for publication there, but they wouldn't do it, claiming that this type of record is something that they wouldn't want people to pursue because of the dangers associated with it. So they didn't recognize it. But life goes on from there. And then this is all happening 1930s, 1940s, 50s, and now in 1950s they opened the first official, like, real-time Gracie Academy in Brazil, and this is it here. And they tried to run a really special operation, really professional. The clientele that we're learning back then was a very kind of upper class, you know, like politicians, and it was a very famous thing to do. It was a very prestigious thing for people to train jiu-jitsu back then. Now it's widespread the world over, but back then it was like, they have the actual attendance cards for former presidents and senators and mayors, and people of that nature that learned back then. It was interesting because back in the day, the students didn't own their own gis. The academy had 600 gis, and they would keep them at the school in these little cubby holes here. Every little drawer is a gi and a towel. So they had everything very organized, and the student would come to class and have their gi waiting for them, and then they would leave, and then we would wash it and then bring it back and the whole thing. So a really smooth operation there. There were no group classes. There were only private classes. The belief was group classes doesn't allow for the same linear learning to optimize the student's progress. So they thought that, you know, one-on-one, 25, 30-minute one-on-one classes a couple times a week was how they did it back in the day. It wasn't really till way later, I think even coming to America, that the group classes became a common thing for jiu-jitsu. Question? That's the flying scissor kick photo. That's actually on the wall of the museum as we walk in when we shut the doors. But the flying scissor kick is an epic photo that is famous around the whole world, and you'll learn that when you get your black belt. 10-4? Okay, good. So this house right here was kind of epic. They had a compound. The house isn't even realistic. It's a compound outside of Rio in Teresópolis, outside in the mountains, about an hour and a half outside of Rio. 18 bathrooms and 21 bedrooms the house had. It was huge. The house had 18 employees who worked here full time, who had 13 kids of their own. So there's 31 people there who were all at the house if nobody was on vacation at the house. And then not to mention the 9 kids of the Grandmaster, 21 kids of Carlos, and I mean, it was just a crazy situation. They would all come up here and spend summers and times and whatnot. The house doesn't exist any longer. It's several city blocks of condominiums and whatnot today, but they had it for quite a time there. It was really cool. This is a water tower with a little meditation room on top of it, and the houses are there. And this is where they train jiu-jitsu. And the grass over here, they would put out a tarp, and they would roll outside. And a little rec room over there. And on the strings, you see little gis drying. Those are all the gis from the workings of the academy. They would bring them up and wash them and then hang dry. And it was funny because my dad tells me, I never saw the place. It was demolished and sold before I was born. But people would drive by the compound not knowing really who lived here, and they would see these hanging kind of white jackets that look like straight jackets, and then you see kids choking each other, and you think it's kind of crazy heads, you know? They didn't know what was going on in here with the compound, like a security tower, you know, it was just, you don't even know. So it was quite the experience, he says. All of them have very fond memories, so they rebuilt that. And you keep coming this way, and you have them working here with the Brazilian Marines, which became very popular later in the era there in Brazil. That's them. That's Carlos on the left and Elio on the right, just stretching out and shaking hands. That's all. Yes. So then all this is in Brazil, 1970s, 1978. My father graduated in law school in Brazil and then came to America. And here you have his actual log books of his students in America. In the beginning, he couldn't get anybody, so little by little, just one word of mouth spread, and you know, started off with 2, 3, 4 students in his garage in Hermosa Beach, which is 5-7 minutes from here, and ended up with he had 130 students training with him every week, with him and Hoyas and a couple brothers, and 80 students on a waiting list to get into the garage. This is after 11 years teaching in the garage. So I mean, it was to the point where packed to the max. And that's when they opened the Gracie Academy, the first location, which was about 5 miles from here, 1989, summer of 1989. Puts us, what, 23 years, I guess, 24 years ago, was the first academy here in the States, or in the Torrance. And then things kind of, you know, went from there. 1989, 91, 92, 93, 4 years later is when the UFC was created, and you guys know the rest from there. Thing blew up, and that's when the Army jumped on board, 1994, and that's what you see in the hallways there is all the military and law enforcement recognition for the work we've done with them for the last 20 years. And it's all good. Now you guys are here keeping it real. What's up?
Why is that there?
Oh, that's an article, you know Mad Magazine? I don't even know if they still print these anymore, do they?
They have a show.
They have
There you go. Mad Magazine was a famous magazine when the UFC hit, and they did a funny article on the Gravy brothers, and made a funny jokes in there. Yes.
Are these toys?
Yes, these are action figures of Hoist and Hickson, that is correct. There's a cool picture of all the brothers here.
Was that a misprint? The one that says Kimbo Slice?
Yeah.
That's where.
That's just the wristband, yeah. So they released a Hoist action figure with his long name.
How come the majority of the family starts with the letter R?
It's a Gracie thing.
It's a Gracie.
Yeah, it's a Carlos and Edu thing. They just felt that there's a certain strength
It's
to them.
easier to track down.
Easier to track down, though. It was just, yeah.
When's your birthday? When's your birthday? When's your birthday?
It was just a belief that the R was a strong letter, so they put R's and K's and C's. They had this whole belief, and they named all their kids. I didn't have much choice in the matter. Yeah.
Whose view is this?
That's my dad's. So this right here is interesting. If you look over here, yeah, let me step to the side over here. So that's my grandfather 62 years ago.
I know
That's him, and that's my dad 62 years ago when he was 1. That's my dad laying down right there on the bottom 62 years later, and the little infant brother on the top, my little brother. So the cool part is both infants are wearing the same exact uniform, which is this uniform from 62 years ago. My dad's original gi, yeah. So this is my son by my grandma way back when. Straight up. You can see it's rotting away a little bit, you know, the initial one with the little initials on the front, RG, which is great because it works for everyone in the family. RG is everyone's initial.
Really great.
You don't enter, I like Hoyo, Helson, Hickson, Helson. What's up? You want to wear that gi, buddy? Want to put it on?
Little. Why does it have a black belt?
Because, man, jiu-jitsu, little baby black belt, man, let it live. It was a baby black belt. Yes.
What is over there?
That's the UFC mock-up. When the UFC 1993, they made a little cage.
Very first.
And yeah, just the kind of idea, the design to see how it would eventually evolve into the whole octagon we see now. So just a little preparation mock-up. Yes.
Why is there only a little bit of people?
Because they, everybody else went home. They just felt like sitting and watching the arena. Just want to chill out.
Thank you.
My pleasure, you guys. If you have any questions, I'll be here for a little bit. My pleasure.
What is it? What is this?
Thank
Yes.
you very much.
Thank you, guys. Yes.
Where's the pizza?
Why isn't there people in here?
Because it's just a little mock-up. It's fake. You want to go in there and fight?